Okay, let's unpack this. Today we are diving deep into, well, one of history's most debated and mysterious artifacts, the Shroud of Turin.
Absolutely. And we have a remarkable stack of sources before us. Really everything from centuries-old historical accounts to cutting-edge scientific analyses.
Yeah, expert perspectives, even deeply personal reflections on this ancient piece of linen. It's quite a collection.
It truly is, touching on so many different fields of study.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to navigate this fascinating material, pulling out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight about this enigmatic cloth for you.
We're going to trace its winding journey through history.
Yep. Jump into the heart of the scientific controversies and findings and see what experts in these sources have to say about where science and faith might, maybe unexpectedly, intersect when studying it.
It promises to be quite a deep dive, moving from, medieval catapults all the way to modern laboratories.
So where do our sources first pick up the story of the shroud in documented history? It looks like that's in the 1350s, Lille, France.
It was reportedly received as a gift by a church dean from a French knight. Geoffroy-Dini, I believe his name was?
Geoffroy-Dini. And right there, the claim is made. This stained linen cloth, what is it, roughly 14 feet by 3.5 feet?
About that, yeah. It's presented as the actual burial wrap of Jesus of Nazareth.
Which, immediately throws up a major historical question, doesn't it? The sources point out, its whereabouts for the, 1,300 years before the 1350s are completely unknown.
Total mystery. And how Dini actually got hold of it, still unknown, according to these accounts.
That early obscurity is, a key part of the historical puzzle here.
Definitely. And things didn't exactly start smoothly. The sources mention Pope Clement III actually denounced it, called it fraudulent.
Really? Denounced it?
Yes. And maybe fueling that, an unnamed artist at the time apparently confessed to forging it.
Wow. So right out of the gate, major pushback.
Big time. And this led the church to reclassify it entirely, shifting it from being considered a true relic, something with direct historical connection,
to just an icon.
To being labeled merely an icon, an image for veneration, but not the real thing, a significant demotion.
Okay. So what happened then?
Well, the sources then describe how, during the chaos of the 100 Years' War, the Janey family somehow regained possession.
The Janey family.
And they began promoting it again, pushing that claim of its genuineness. Eventually, through marriage and inheritance, it passed to the powerful House of Savoy.
The House of Savoy. Okay, they become key players in its history.
Very key. They frequently displayed it during big celebrations, public events across Europe.
And that detail, them displaying it, handling it, that becomes important later, doesn't it?
It becomes very important when we get to the science. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, eventually, the Savoy family entrusts it to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. That was 1578.
1578 is the year, and that is where it has remained ever since.
Giving it the name we all know it by, the Shroud of Turin. So that brings us out of its early kind of murky journey and sets the stage for when science really steps in. And this is where things get particularly complex and, frankly, controversial, starting in the late 1980s.
Right. This is the era of really intense scientific scrutiny. People were excited about using modern techniques, especially radiocarbon dating, to finally pin down the age of the cloth.
And it was a big deal. 3 highly respected laboratories were involved: University of Arizona,
the Federal Institute of Technology in Switzerland, and Oxford University. Top-tier labs. They were each given small samples of the cloth.
And the result they published, it sent shockwaves.
It really did. They dated the material to the Middle Ages, specifically somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD.
Which puts it squarely in the period it first popped up in France.
Exactly. So for many people, especially in the scientific community at the time, this was it. Conclusive proof the shroud could not be the burial cloth of Jesus.
Yeah.
Case closed.
Case closed, right. But maybe not entirely.
Well, that was certainly the dominant conclusion for a long time. But our sources reveal, this wasn't the end of the story for everyone. Some researchers, like those involved with the Shroud of Turin research project STURP, they felt the initial conclusions might have been flawed. Maybe based on incomplete information,
Okay, so they kept digging.
They kept digging. They continued their investigations. And this is where that point about the Savoy family handling the shroud comes back in.
Right, the displaying, the handling.
Exactly. These ongoing researchers developed and really championed what's known as the contamination hypothesis.
Contamination. Okay, what's the idea there?
The core idea is pretty straightforward. The small samples taken for that 1988 dating They argue they weren't representative of the original cloth.
Because they were contaminated.
Contaminated. Think back to the Middle Ages. The sources describe the Savoy family handling the shroud quite, well, robustly isn't the word. Holding it up, even throwing it out over balconies for crowds to see sometimes.
Wow. Okay, so that would cause wear and tear.
Significant wear and tear, particularly around the edges and corners. And those worn areas, naturally, were repaired over the centuries.
Repaired.
With what? Exactly. Medieval repairs involved patching or weaving in new linen. But crucially, according to these sources, these repairs were made with linen that was mixed with cotton fibers. Cotton, a different material, certainly from the Middle Ages. And the contamination hypothesis argues that the samples given to the labs in '88 were taken specifically from this repaired, contaminated area near the border.
So the labs might have accurately dated the repair threads, the medieval patch.
That's the argument.
But not the original first-century cloth underneath or elsewhere.
That is a powerful argument presented by proponents of this hypothesis. It fundamentally challenges the '88 results.
One source even mentions an expert in invisible weaving, someone who can spot these ancient repairs.
Yes, exactly. An expert who can identify repairs almost imperceptible to the naked eye. And this expert reportedly helped pinpoint these specific medieval men's right in the area where the samples were taken.
Okay, that's a fundamental challenge right there, coming straight from the sources. And this line of research, it didn't stop there, did it? There have been more recent scientific investigations.
That's right. Our sources highlight a study from, I believe, 2021 by Italian researchers. They used a completely different non-destructive technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAXS.
WAXS. Okay, non-destructive. What did that reveal?
Well, instead of dating the carbon, it analyzes the structural deterioration of the cellulose within the linen fibers themselves over time. It's like looking at the aging process at a molecular level.
And what did they find?
They found a level of structural deterioration consistent with linen aged much, much older than the Middle Ages. Their findings aligned with linen dated to roughly 5574 AD.
First century.
Smack dab in the first century.
Which again aligns with the traditional belief about the shroud's origin.
It does. And the sources also mention other supporting evidence, things found over the years by different experts using different methods.
Like what?
Things like nanoscopic traces of specific soil types and pollen grains found on the cloth.
Pollen? From where?
Crucially, these were identified as species native to the Jerusalem area, a finding that proponents argue is highly consistent with the first century origin for the cloth being in that location.
So, putting these sources side by side, wow, we see a scientific picture that is, well, far from settled. The 1988 dating is seriously challenged by this contamination hypothesis, and newer studies using totally different techniques seem to point towards a first century date.
It's definitely a complex scientific debate, and it's still very much ongoing. There are strong opinions on both sides.
But okay, even beyond the age of the cloth itself, the sources really dig into characteristics of the image on the shroud, the image of the man. And these are things science, frankly, still seems unable to fully explain.
This is where the mystery truly deepens, I think. The image itself is unique in several really baffling ways, according to these sources. First off, it's a perfect negative image.
Which is bizarre in itself, and we'll circle back to the significance of that.
And it also contains, remarkably, three-dimensional information, encoded somehow in the shading or intensity.
So 3D info, how do they even figure that out?
That wasn't even discovered until the 1970s. Researchers used imaging technology initially developed by NASA for mapping planets like Mars, I think.
No way.
Yes, they ran the shroud image through it, and out popped a 3D rendering. It has this kind of photographic quality, which is just astonishing given its supposed age.
And the depth, or maybe the shallowness of the image, the sources talk about that.
Oh yeah, it's almost incomprehensibly shallow. The coloration is only about 200 nanometers deep, just on the very, very surface of the fibers.
200 nanometers? That's tiny, like slicing a single human hair.
16 to 18 times, yeah. That thin. And it's only on the very outside layer of the threads making up the cloth. The image doesn't penetrate the fibers.
Which is totally different from the bloodstains, right?
Completely different. The blood, as you'd expect, soaked into the core of the fibers. It wicked through the cloth in places. But the image, it's just this incredibly superficial coloration on the absolute surface.
So what does that mean for trying to figure out how it got there?
Well, the sources highlight the crucial implication. There are no brushstrokes. There's no paint, no pigment, no dyes, no stains detected. There's no physical substance making the image that you can just scrape off and analyze in a lab.
Nothing comes off if you touch it.
Nothing comes off. This superficial nature, combined with its other characteristics being a negative, having 3D info, that specific depth leads many experts cited in these sources to conclude something pretty startling.
Which is?
That the technology or method needed to create such an image simply did not exist historically. And, they argue, replicating it perfectly remains impossible even with today's technology.
So science can study the cloth, the blood, the pollen, but the image itself is this profound enigma because it's not really made of anything science can grab onto or replicate.
That seems to be the crux of it, yeah. It defies standard scientific explanations for image formation.
And yet, despite the mystery of how it formed, the physical markings depicted on the cloth tell an incredibly detailed story.
Oh, incredibly detailed. The sources painstakingly describe the wounds shown in the image.
Yeah, what do they list?
Puncture wounds consistent with a crown of thorns on the scalp, a swollen cheek, possibly a broken nose, nail wounds through the wrists, not the palms, which is anatomically correct for supporting body weight in crucifixion, unlike many artistic depictions.
Right, wrists, not palms.
Nail wounds through the feet. Over 120 scourge marks across the back, chest, legs consistent with a Roman flagrum, abrasions on the knees and nose, maybe suggesting falls.
Falls while carrying something heavy, perhaps.
Plausible. And then there's a major wound on the side, clearly inflicted after death, post-mortem.
This spear wound.
Seems likely. And what's fascinating about that side wound, the sources mentioned analyses found traces consistent with both red blood cells and a clear fluid, like blood serum or pericardial fluid.
Which matches the gospel description of blood and water.
It aligns very closely with that description, yes. It's an almost forensic depiction of extreme trauma and execution.
It really is. But do the experts in the sources say these are just typical crucifixion wounds, or is there something more specific?
That's a key point. They note that while many wounds are consistent with crucifixion generally, some details are highly unusual for a standard Roman crucifixion, yet align specifically with the gospel account of Jesus' death.
Like what?
The crown of thorns, for instance. That wasn't standard Roman practice. The post-mortem side wound is another specific detail.
Okay.
They also point out the complete lack of any signs of decomposition on the cloth. This suggests the body wasn't in the wrap for very long, maybe 30 or 40 hours at most. Put together, these experts argue it makes it highly improbable the image is just of any random crucified man from that era.
But rather the specific individual described in the Gospels.
That's the argument presented in these sources, yes. The combination of common and unique features points for them directly to Jesus.
So, given it doesn't seem to be painted or stained or scorched in any conventional way, how do the sources grapple with how this image might have formed? What are the theories?
Well, one perspective offered, more philosophical perhaps, is that the image is the natural effect of a supernatural event.
A natural effect of a supernatural event. Okay, unpack that a bit.
It sort of implies a process we might recognize, like radiation or energy transfer, but triggered by something beyond the purely physical laws as we know them, like the resurrection itself being the trigger.
Are there more scientifically framed hypotheses?
There is one mentioned, though often described as unofficial or speculative. It's sometimes called the radiation hypothesis.
Radiation, like from the body.
The theory suggests that perhaps at the moment of resurrection, a brief, intense burst of energy, maybe electromagnetic radiation, emanated from the body.
Okay.
And this burst, it's proposed, could have caused that incredibly faint superficial discoloration on the very top layers of the fibers, essentially creating the image like a scorch from radiation.
Could that theory also explain the carbon dating issue?
Proponents suggest it might. They speculate that this intense energy burst could have somehow generated new carbon-14 atoms within the cloth itself, long after the flax was harvested.
So it would artificially reset the C14 clock, making it seem much younger when tested centuries later.
That's the idea, though the sources do note this specific part of the theory, the C14 generation, is pretty debated, even among those who favor a radiation model for the image formation. It's highly speculative physics.
And the sources must acknowledge the massive scientific question this raises, right? How could a human body possibly emit energy like that?
Oh, absolutely. That's the fundamental hurdle from a purely scientific view. There's no known biological mechanism for that. And some who hold this radiation view directly link that extraordinary energy source to Scripture, proposing it was the power of God raising Christ from the dead.
So it's a hypothesis attempting to bridge the scientific puzzle of the image with a theological explanation for its cause.
You could put it that way, yes. It tries to offer a potential physical mechanism, however extraordinary, linked to a belief in the resurrection.
Okay, let's step back from the deep science for a moment and talk about a really pivotal event in the Shroud's modern history, one that utterly changed how the world saw it the first time it was photographed, back in 1898.
Yes, Secondo Pia. That was a monumental moment.
Who was he?
Secondo Pia was an Italian lawyer, but also an amateur photographer, pretty passionate about the new technology. He got permission from the House of Savoy, who still owned it then, to photograph the Shroud during a public exhibition in Turin.
So he sets up his gear, takes the pictures, probably in those big glass plate negatives they used back then, goes into his darkroom to develop them, and what he saw must have just blown his mind.
It had to have been astonishing. The photographic negative, the reversed image on the glass plate, didn't just show the expected reversal of light and dark from the cloth.
Yep.
It revealed what looked like a perfect, lifelike, positive image of the man.
Okay, let's pause on that because it's kind of counterintuitive. The Shroud itself was acting like a photographic negative.
Precisely. Dark areas on the cloth, like the hair and beard, appeared light on Pia's negative plate. And the lighter areas on the cloth, the body highlights, appeared dark on the negative plate.
So Pia's negative essentially reversed the Shroud's inherent negativeness, revealing the positive image.
Exactly. It was the first time anyone had really seen the man on the Shroud, clearly.
And the implications were huge.
Revolutionary. Experts in the sources emphasize just how impossible it would have been for any artist centuries earlier to intentionally create an image that was already a negative.
Right, long before photography was even conceived of.
Let alone one that also contains 3D information and appears as a mirror image. There was just no understanding of negative imaging or photographic principles back then.
So this 1898 photograph wasn't just taking a picture of the Shroud, it was discovering the fundamental nature of the image itself.
It absolutely was. It was a turning point. It allowed people to see the incredible detail, the lifelike quality, and it kicked off a whole new era of scientific study and, well, intense public interest.
It really brought the Shroud from being this dimly perceived, maybe revered object to something visually stunning and deeply, deeply puzzling.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay. So we've traced the history, navigated the really complex science around dating and the image itself, seen the impact of that 1898 photo. Now let's look at how our sources discuss these seemingly different worlds, science and faith, when it comes to the Shroud. Many argue they aren't necessarily contradictory here.
Yeah, that's a key theme that comes through. The sources present this idea that studying the Shroud can involve looking at it with sort of different sets of eyes at the same time.
Different eyes? How so?
Well, one source puts it nicely, viewing it with the eyes of a scientist.
Yeah.
For the empirical understanding, analyzing the fibers, the blood chemistry, the physics of the image.
Okay, the data-driven approach.
Right. And simultaneously viewing it with the eyes of a pilgrim, engaging with it on a level of faith, personal meaning, spiritual resonance.
It reminds me of that idea referenced in one source from Pope St. John Paul II about faith and reason being like two wings needed to reach truth.
Exactly that analogy. The Shroud, in this view, becomes this really compelling case study for how these two winds can coexist, maybe even help each other.
And do the sources give examples of this?
Yeah.
Of people bridging that gap?
Oh, absolutely. There are powerful personal accounts shared. Many scientists and researchers, people who've spent decades studying the Shroud, they describe how their detailed, rigorous work hasn't undermined their faith. If anything, it's often deepened it.
How so?
It provides this tangible, almost tactile connection to the events described in the Gospels. One researcher even likens it to a Thomas experience, feeling like they can almost touch the wounds.
That's quite poignant. There's also a story in the sources about someone who wasn't even a Shroud expert, right? A lifestyle expert.
Yes, Randy Alteg. He saw the Shroud during a public exhibition in Turin in 2015. Not as a scientist, just as a visitor.
And what was his experience?
He describes feeling this incredibly deep personal calling, a sense of discovery. He left absolutely convinced it wasn't a forgery and felt, in his own words, like he met Jesus for the first time right there, encountering the image on that cloth.
Wow, So this idea of a profound personal encounter, it seems to be a recurring theme.
It really is. It suggests that while, yes, parts of the shroud, the blood, the fibers, the pollen can be put under the scientific microscope, the image itself seems to resist that full scientific explanation. And it's presented by some in the sources as a phenomenon that ultimately requires a leap of belief.
Like it wasn't meant to be fully explained by science?
That thought is offered, yeah. That perhaps the image wasn't intended to be scientifically defined or replicated perfectly, but maybe serves as a kind of belief mechanism, something that points beyond the purely physical.
That's fascinating. The sources even include descriptions of people feeling the shroud has an almost palpable presence, an energy.
Yes, descriptions like it being alive and profoundly changing the lives of people who study it closely. Sometimes even those who started out as atheists or skeptics.
So it seems to impact people on a really deep personal level, regardless of where they start.
Oh, that definitely comes across. And a really beautiful final thought presented in some sources ties back to the resurrection.
How so?
That the shroud isn't simply a death cloth, a morbid relic. If it's authentic, the image only exists because of the resurrection. In that sense, it's fundamentally a resurrection cloth caused by that very event.
A resurrection cloth. That reframes it significantly. And that powerful connection leads us right to our final point before we wrap up the compelling link some sources draw to the empty tomb account in the Gospels, specifically John chapter 20.
Right. The Gospel account describes Mary Magdalene finding the tomb empty, running to tell Peter and John. They race back.
John gets there first.
John gets there first, looks in, and sees the linen burial cloths lying there. Plural. Cloths.
And this is where our sources introduce another specific cloth, often mentioned alongside the shroud, the sudarium.
The sudarium of Oviedo, yes. Sometimes called a face cloth, or cudarium. It was reportedly a Roman custom to place a smaller cloth over the face of someone who died, especially during crucifixion, perhaps out of respect or practicality.
Okay, so a separate face cloth. What do the sources say about it?
Well, the findings reported are quite striking. The sudarium is housed in Oviedo, Spain, and it has been subjected to scientific analysis. These analyses reportedly show it has the exact same rare blood type AB as the blood found on the Shroud of Turin.
Wow, the exact same blood type, on two separate cloths, geographically distant for centuries.
That's what the sources report, yes. And there's more. When the blood markings and distortions on the sudarium are studied and compared to the face on the shroud image, they reportedly align perfectly. The patterns of blood flow, the nasal area swelling, it's as if they covered the same man's face during the same traumatic events.
So these aren't just two unrelated cloths mentioned vaguely in texts. Sources are presenting scientific evidence potentially linking them to the very same individual.
Precisely. That's the connection being made.
And what about John seeing the cloths in the tomb? Is there significance to how he saw them?
Yes, the sources highlight that detail. John sees the linen cloths lying there, and the sudarium, which had been around Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloth, but folded up in a place by itself.
Folded up separately. Why is that detail important?
Well, they explain that in the cultural context of that time, a servant folding a napkin or cloth after a meal and setting it aside was a specific signal. It meant the master wasn't finished, he was coming back. It wasn't abandonment, it was a deliberate sign of return.
So John, seeing that folded face cloth, according to this perspective, he would have instantly understood that cultural signal, that it meant he's coming back.
That's the powerful interpretation offered in these sources. John saw that specific detail, the folded sudarium, and he believed. He understood the message.
Wow.
And these cloths, the shroud and the sudarium, are presented by some as these incredible, tangible remnants of that transformative event, the resurrection, still held in custody today.
What a powerful connection to draw from the sources, linking the physical objects to that moment of belief.
It really adds another profound layer to the whole story.
So we've taken quite the journey together in this deep dive. We've unearthed the shroud's long, often mysterious history.
Definitely mysterious.
Waded through the really complex scientific debate around its age, from that controversial 88 carbon dating to the compelling newer findings suggesting contamination and a possible first-century date.
A real scientific back and forth.
We've examined the truly puzzling scientific characteristics of the image itself. The negativity, the 3D info, the incredible shallowness, learned about that game-changing 1898 photograph.
That photo was key.
Discussed the intricate, often deeply personal intersection of science and faith that the shroud represents for so many. And finally, connected it back to the empty tomb account in the Gospels and this related sudarium cloth.
And through it all, that central mystery remains: the formation of the image itself, still resisting a full scientific explanation, making this artifact utterly unique.
Absolutely. And we've seen how the sources present these different ways of viewing the shroud. Through the rigorous lens of scientific analysis, yes, but also as an object that can profoundly inspire faith and lead to personal encounter.
It really does seem to sit at this fascinating crossroads of history, science, and, well, belief.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe here's a final thought drop from the sources for you to consider. How does this ancient cloth, with its potent blend of unresolved scientific puzzles, persistent historical questions, and the profound spiritual implications presented in these sources, how does it challenge us? Does it push us to think about the very boundaries of our knowledge, of belief, and maybe the possibility of the unexplained? Is it, as some in the sources compellingly suggest, perhaps a kind of mirror, reflecting not just a historical figure, but maybe something deeper about our own ongoing human search for truth and meaning in the world?